Many years ago, in the village of Urodo, the land woke up before the people. At dawn, birds shouted from the palm trees, women swept their compounds, while the men prepared for farm with their hoes resting on their shoulders. The village believed that the earth respects those who respect work. Every man in Urodo knew this. Well, every man except Ejiro. Ejiro lived in a small mud house near the edge of the village where the bush began to swallow the path. He was tall, handsome, strong, but most importantly, extremely allergic to effort. If laziness were a profession, Ejiro would have been chairman of the board. Every day, when the cock crowed in the morning, the village rose like a marching band preparing for a parade. But Ejiro turned to the other side of the bed and continued sleeping like a man who had signed a peace treaty with the sun. By the time farmers returned from their early morning walk, Ejiro would finally appear outside his house, stretching his body like someone who had been working all night in a dream. One morning, Mama Ubi passed his house carrying a basket of cassava leaves on her head. She stopped and stared at him. "Ejiro, have you finished sleeping for the government today?" Ejiro yawned. "Mama Ubi, sleep is part of good health." Mama Ubi rolled her eyes. "Your mates are cultivating farms while you are here cultivating sleep." Ejiro grinned. "Don't worry, one day I will be rich, then you'll remember these words." Mama Ubi laughed so loudly that two goats looked up in confusion. In this same Urodo village, without work, even palm wine does not enter a calabash by itself. Just then, a man appeared on the path carrying a hoe over his shoulder. His name was Temison. He was Ejiro's cousin. Temison believed strongly in two things: farm work and minding your own business. Unfortunately, Ejiro lived too close for the second rule to succeed. Temison stopped in front of the house. "You are still here?" Ejiro looked around dramatically. "Where else would I be?" "On your farm," Temison replied. Ejiro scratched his head slowly. "Which farm?" Temison stared at him like a man speaking to a stubborn goat. "The farm every man is supposed to have." Ejiro waved his hand. "My brother, farm work is too stressful." Temison laughed once. "The earth will not feed you because you are handsome." But Ejiro leaned back on the wooden bench under his mango tree and smiled. "One day I will make money without suffering like you." Temison shook his head. "You have been saying that since you were 15. Mama Ubi clapped her hands in disappointment. "This boy believes wealth will knock on his door like a visitor." Ejiro stretched his legs comfortably. "Don't worry about me. Some people sweat before they eat, but smart people think before they eat." Mama Ubi stared at him. "Your thinking has not produced even one tuber of yam." Mama Ubi and Temison laughed. Ejiro laughed too, as nothing in the conversation disturbed him. Laziness had made his skin thick like the bark of an iroko tree. For a long while, life in Urodo continued as usual. Farmers worked and women sold vegetables, while the children ran around chasing chickens that had no intention of being caught. Ejiro spent most afternoons under the mango tree discussing big dreams with anyone foolish enough to listen. One afternoon, Ofure stopped near the tree on her way back from the stream. Ofure was a young woman who sold pepper and okra in the village market. She looked at Ejiro sitting comfortably on the bench and asked, "You are still here?" Ejiro smiled proudly. "I am supervising the village." Ofure shook her head slowly. "If laziness were palm oil, your head would shine like the chief's drum." Ejiro laughed. "Ofure, when I become rich, you will regret laughing at me." Ofure balanced the clay pot on her head carefully. "When that miracle happens, I will personally cook pounded yam for you." She walked away smiling. Ejiro watched her go. Then he leaned back against the tree again and looked towards the distant forest where the farmland stretched beyond the village. He sighed deeply. deeply. The truth was that Ejiro liked money, he liked respect, and he liked the idea of people greeting him with admiration. What he did not like was the suffering that usually came before those things. Later that afternoon, Temiso returned from the farm covered in sweat. He dropped his hoe beside a tree and sat down heavily. "You know something?" he said. "What?" Ejiro asked. "The soil is very rich this year." Ejiro looked toward the forest again. Temiso continued. "Even the old abandoned land inside the bush looks fertile now." Ejiro turned his head slowly. "Abandoned land?" "Yes, so there is an old farm deep inside the forest. Nobody uses it anymore." "Why?" Ejiro asked. Temiso shrugged. "It's a long story." Ejiro sat up slightly. "What kind of story?" Temiso wiped sweat from his head and explained. "Something about an old shrine that used to be there many years ago. The elders said people stopped farming there after strange things began happening." Mama Ubi appeared again from the path carrying firewood. She heard the last sentence and added, "That place should remain abandoned forever." Ejiro looked curious. "Why?" Mama Ubi lowered her voice. "Some land remember things." Ejiro laughed loudly. "Mama Ubi, the only thing land remembers is fertilizer." Mama Ubi shook her head. "Continue laughing." Temiso picked up his hoe and said, "I am going home." He looked at Ejiro carefully. "Don't go near that place, oh." Ejiro waved lazily. "Abeg, I am too tired for adventures." But that evening, something interesting happened. As Ejiro sat alone under the mango tree, watching the sun disappear behind the forest, the words "abandoned land" kept walking around inside his head. The land had rich soil, and there was no competition with other farmers. He stood up slowly, and a small smile appeared on his face. "Maybe the earth has been waiting for me." Then he picked up an old cutlass and began walking towards the forest. This particular path that led into the forest behind Urodo village was narrow and uneven. Most farmers used the wider road that curved around the palm trees towards the common farmland. Only hunters and stubborn goats usually passed through the smaller path. Ejiro walked slowly at first, swinging the cutlass carelessly against small branches that dared to block his way. However, the deeper he moved into the forest, the quieter the air became. Every village sound disappeared, and all that could be heard was the restless chatter of insects and the distant cry of birds that sounded as if they were arguing over something serious. After some time, the path opened into a wider piece of land. Ejiro stopped. The place looked strange. It was clearly a farmland once. Old ridges still lay across the ground like tired snakes. The soil was dark and thick. Cassava stems from long ago stood dry and crooked like forgotten walking stick. And then, at the center of the land, stood something that did not belong to farming. It was a small clay structure which was half broken, with faded white chalk marks across the surface. Old pots lay around it, and feathers were stuck to the mud walls. Ejiro stared at it. He walked closer and realized that it was an old shrine. Obviously not the kind villagers still respected. This one looked abandoned by both people and spirits. Bush grass had begun climbing over it, as if nature itself wanted to hide the place. Ejiro scratched his head. So, this is the famous shrine. He circled it slowly and nothing happened. No thunder, strange wind, or spirits jumped out to collect rent. He laughed. Village people and their stories. From where he stood, the soil beneath his feet felt soft and rich. He bent down and picked up a handful. It was dark and heavy like good cocoa soil. This land is perfect, he said to himself. He looked around the farm again. The place was lonely. There was no farmer around or anyone that could monitor how lazily he planned to walk. Ejiro lifted the cutlass and began clearing the bush with small careless strokes. He walked for a while until sweat began forming on his forehead. The experience shocked him. This farm work is rude, he complained loudly to nobody. He cleared a small space and created a few ridges without enthusiasm. Then he planted several cassava stems he had brought from the village. After the fifth ridge, he stopped. That is enough for today, he announced proudly. The farm looked small and untidy. Any serious farmer would have laughed at him, but Ejiro wiped his hands on his trousers and glanced once more at the broken shrine. Don't worry, he told it jokingly. I am not here to disturb your ancestors. He laughed again at his own joke. Then he began walking back toward the village. By the time he returned, the sun was gone. Mama Ubi saw him first. She was roasting corn outside her compound. Ejiro, she called. Yes, Ejiro replied. Where are you coming from? Ejiro lifted the cutlass proudly. My farm. Mama Ubi stared at him for a moment. Your what? My farm, Ejiro repeated. Mama Ubi laughed so loudly that the corn almost fell from her hand. This boy has started telling professional lies. Temison appeared from the path, carrying fresh cassava leaves. What is happening here? He asked. Mama Ubi pointed at Ejiro. Your cousin said he now has a farm. Temison raised an eyebrow. Where? Ejiro smiled. In the forest. Temison's face changed slightly. Which part of the forest? The abandoned land, Ejiro said proudly. Temison dropped the cassava leaves from his shoulder. You went there? Yes, Ejiro nodded. Near the old shrine? Yes, Ejiro nodded again. Mama Ubi slapped her chest. Aye! Temison stepped closer. I told you not to go there. Ejiro waved his hand dismissively. My brother, nothing is there. Temison's voice became really serious. People stopped farming there for a reason now. Ejiro shrugged. Fear is expensive. I cannot afford it. Mama Ubi shook her head. Mark my words, a land that sleeps should not be woken carelessly. Ejiro stretched his body proudly. You people worry too much. That night, the village slept peacefully, and deep inside the forest, the abandoned farm lay silent under the pale moonlight. The broken shrine stood quietly at the center of the land. Then something happened. The soil near the shrine shifted small, like the earth stretching after a long sleep. The ridges Ejiro had made that evening began to look different. The soil sank deeper and the cassava stems stood stronger. When morning arrived in Urodo village, farmers prepared for work. Temison left early as usual, and Ejiro woke late as usual. Then, around mid-morning, curiosity pushed him toward the forest again. He walked slowly toward the farm, whistling carelessly. But when he arrived, he stopped and wiped his eyes. The cassava stems looked stronger. The leaves had grown too, and the ridges looked fuller. Ejiro blinked. He walked closer and touched the leaves. They were not like this yesterday. He looked around the farm again. Nothing else seemed strange. The broken shrine still stood quietly, and the soil remained dark and calm. Ejiro shrugged. Maybe the land likes me. He laughed. Then he turned and walked back toward the village. At first, he did not tell anyone what he had seen. The truth was that even Ejiro himself did not understand it properly. Perhaps the soil was naturally rich. Perhaps the rain from 2 nights ago had helped the plants in advance. Perhaps he had simply forgotten how the cassava looked the day before. You know, the mind of a lazy man is very good at finding explanations that allow him to avoid serious thinking. That evening, Ejiro sat again under his mango tree like a king, supervising a kingdom that did not know it belonged to him. Temison passed by carrying a bundle of firewood. Did you go to your farm today? He asked. Ejiro nodded yes. Temison waited, and Ejiro leaned back comfortably. The soil is excellent. Temison looked suspicious. Did you work today? Ejiro scratched his chin. I only supervised. Temison shook his head slowly. You cannot supervise what you have not built. Mama Ubi appeared again from the path carrying vegetables. What are you people discussing? Temison replied, your favorite lazy man now has a farm. Mama Ubi stared at Ejiro cautiously. You truly planted something there? Ejiro nodded, yes. Mama Ubi lowered the basket from her head. And the shrine? Ejiro shrugged. It is old and broken. It is not doing anything there. Mama Ubi clicked her tongue loudly. Hey! Temison spoke again. You should leave that place alone, no. Ejiro laughed. Do you know something I don't know? Temison hesitated. Then he continued. My grandfather once told me that the shrine there belonged to farmers long ago. They believed the land had spirits that helped crops grow. Ejiro raised an eyebrow. That sounds useful. Mama Ubi slapped his shoulder lightly. Foolish boy. Temison continued. The elders used to give offering there before planting. When people stopped the rituals, strange things began happening on that farm. So the village abandoned it. Ejiro leaned forward slightly. And nothing bad has happened since? Temison shook his head. Yes, because nobody disturbs the place. Ejiro waved his hand. Stories, stories, stories. Mama Ubi sighed. Young men believe nothing until trouble greets them personally. Ejiro stood up and stretched his body. My farm will become the best in this village. Mark my word. Temison shook his head again. First of all, become a farmer. That night, the village slept, but sleep did not come easily to Ejiro. The image of the farm kept returning to his mind. The cassava had clearly grown faster than normal. He could not deny it. Late in the night, he woke up suddenly. At first, he did not know why. Then, he heard a faint sound. It was not inside the village or near the houses. It came from the direction of the forest. Ejiro sat upright and listened carefully as the sound continued. It came as a digging sound. Then it paused and continued digging. He frowned. No farmer walks in the middle of the night. Curiosity began to grow inside him, but fear also sat beside it. After a few minutes, the sound stopped and Ejiro lay back down slowly. Perhaps it is the animals, he told himself. But the thought remained in his mind throughout the night. The next morning, he went to the farm again. When he reached the land, he stopped immediately. The farm looked different, very different. The ridges were taller and the cassava plants stood stronger. Some leaves had grown wide and thick like plants that had been growing for months. Ejiro walked across the farm slowly and muttered, "This is not possible." He bent down and touched the soil. It was still soft, dark and rich. He looked towards the broken shrine. Nothing moved there. The clay pots remained exactly where they had been and the air felt normal. Yet, the farm looked healthier than it had any right to be. Ejiro began smiling. This land truly likes me. He stood up proudly and boasted. Temison would be jealous. That afternoon, he planted more cassava stems. He walked faster than the previous day because excitement had begun replacing his laziness. By evening, he returned to the village with a confident smile. Mama Ubi noticed it immediately and asked, "Why are you smiling like a man who has found buried money?" "My farm will surprise you," Ejiro said. She laughed. "Okay, we will see." From then on, Ejiro went there to plant more crops every evening, and each morning when he returned, the farm looked stronger. Soon, the farm began looking like a land that had been cultivated for months, and word about it slowly spread through the village. One afternoon, Ofure stopped Ejiro near the stream. "I heard your farm is growing well." Ejiro smiled proudly. "The soil respects me." Ofure looked at him carefully. "Farming normally requires hard work." Ejiro shrugged. Maybe the land likes my face." Ofure shook her head. "Be careful." "Why?" Ejiro asked. "Things that grow too fast often end too fast," she warned. Ejiro laughed. "You people worry too much." However, Every night, strange things continued happening. The digging sound returned and lasted longer now. One night, Ejiro sat outside his house listening carefully to the digging sound. The sound clearly came from the forest. That night, his curiosity grew stronger, and then finally he stood up and whispered, "If someone is stealing from my farm, I must see it." He picked up a lantern and began walking slowly toward the forest. Unknown to him, what he would see that night would remove sleep from his life for many days. The path into the bush looked different at night. The village slept behind him. Only the dogs noticed his movements. One of them lifted its head, looked at him, then returned to sleep as if the matter did not concern it. Ejiro walked nervously and the digging sound grew louder. It sounded organized, patient, and intentional. Ejiro's stomach tightened. He lowered the lantern flame slightly and saw the farm ahead. The broken shrine stood at the center of the land, and the ridges lay across the field exactly where he had made them. At first, nothing moved. The sound stopped. Ejiro frowned and stepped closer to the farm. Then the soil began to move slowly like someone turning in sleep. Ejiro froze. The soil in one ridge rose gently. Then it fell back again. Another ridge shifted. Ejiro whispered to himself, "How is this?" A thin crack appeared in the soil near the shrine, and something beneath the earth pushed upward. The soil itself was swelling and collapsing slowly, as if something large moved underneath. Ejiro felt the hair on his neck rise. Then the digging sound returned, but this time it came from beneath the ground. The ridges began adjusting themselves. The soil slid carefully into place, and the cassava stems straightened. One plant leaned upward as if invisible fingers were lifting it. Ejiro's mouth opened. No! He stepped backward slowly. The farm continued moving. The ridges formed themselves again, and the soil packed itself tightly around the stems. Then everything stopped and the land became silent. The cassava leaves moved gently in the night breeze as if nothing had happened. Ejiro stood there for several seconds without breathing properly. His first thought was simple: run. But his legs did not move. Instead, he found himself staring at the shrine. The broken clay structure lay unchanged, but the soil around it had sunk slightly. Ejiro whispered again, "This is not normal." Just then, a faint whisper came from the direction of the shrine, like the wind passing through dry leaves. Ejiro leaned forward without meaning to. The whisper came clearer. "The land remembers." Ejiro dropped the lantern and the flame died instantly. Darkness swallowed the farm. For a moment, he could not hear anything except his own breathing. That was when he ran. His legs moved faster than he had ever allowed them to move in his life. By the time he reached the edge of the village, his chest felt like it might explode. He stopped near the mango tree beside his house and looked around. The village still slept peacefully. Nothing there suggested that the forest had just shown him something impossible. Ejiro sat down slowly, panting hard. What did I just see? By morning, women started sweeping their compounds while the farmers prepared for work. Temison passed Ejiro's house and saw him sitting quietly under the tree. "You woke early today," Temison said. Ejiro nodded. "Yes." "Are you going to the farm?" he asked. Ejiro hesitated and nodded. "Yes." Temison smiled. "Good. Hard work is finally entering your life." Ejiro did not reply. He walked toward the forest again that morning. When he reached the farm, he stopped. The cassava looked excellent and better than the previous day. It was healthier and stronger. The ridges stood firm without any sign of disturbance or movement. The shrine looked exactly as it had looked before. Ejiro walked slowly through the farm and touched the leaves. They felt strong and fresh. Gradually, his fear from the night before began fading. Perhaps Perhaps he had imagined everything. Maybe the darkness had confused his eyes. He looked around the farm again. Everything appeared peaceful, but then he noticed something that made his stomach tighten again. He had planted only 8 ridges of cassava. Now there were 12. Ejiro counted it again carefully. 1, 2, 3, 4. 10, 11, 12. He stepped back slowly. I did not plant this. He scratched his head and then said aloud, maybe I forgot. But the sentence did not convince him. Ejiro might be lazy, but he was not foolish. A farmer remembers how many ridges he makes, the same way a trader remembers the money in her purse. Still, the sight of the healthy crops slowly pacified him. He bent down and touched the leaves again, and a slow smile returned to his face. Well, if the farm wants to help me, I will not argue. By the time he returned to Urodo village, his confidence had grown again. Mama Ubi saw him first. You went to inspect your kingdom? Yes, Ejiro replied proudly. And what did you see? She asked. Ejiro stretched his chest and said, my farm is growing better than anyone's. Mama Ubi laughed. You planted cassava for 3 days and you're already speaking like a chief farmer. Temison appeared from the path carrying a bundle of fresh yams. You went there again? He asked. Yes, Ejiro nodded. Temison nodded. Good. The farm will teach you patience. Ejiro smiled. The farm is already teaching me success. Temison looked at him carefully. What does that mean? Ejiro leaned forward slightly and said, my crops are growing faster than normal. Temison frowned. That is not how farming works. Ejiro shrugged. Come and see. Temison looked uncertain, but curiosity pulled him forward. Let's go. The 2 men walked towards the forest. When they reached the farm, Temison stopped. He bent down and examined the soil carefully. These cassava stems look strong. Ejiro crossed his arms proudly. I told you. Temison moved slowly across the ridges and counted them. Then he turned toward Ejiro. How many ridges did you make? 8, Ejiro replied. Temison frowned. But there are 12 here. Ejiro laughed. Yes, I noticed that too. Temison stared at him. You planted more? Ejiro shook his head. No. Temison frowned. Then who did? The question hung in the air. Ejiro shrugged. Maybe the soil shifted. Temison looked toward the shrine. His face became serious. You should leave this land, Ejiro. Ejiro laughed loudly. My farm is growing well and you want me to leave? Temison shook his head. This place is not normal. Ejiro's voice hardened. Good farms are never normal. Leave me alone. Temison sighed. You are stubborn. They returned to the village. However, within 2 weeks, the farm became the strongest in the area. The cassava grew tall. Pepper plants spread wide all over the farm. Vegetables covered the ridges like green carpets. The villagers began talking. Mama Ubi announced the news everywhere she went. That lazy boy's farm is producing miracles. Ofure visited the farm one afternoon. She walked slowly across the ridges and looked carefully at the crops. This is strange, she said. Ejiro smiled proudly. The land respects me. Ofure did not smile. Things that grow too fast usually hide something. Ejiro laughed. You people worry too much. The first harvest came earlier than anyone expected. Ejiro carried baskets of vegetables to the market. People bought them quickly because the crops looked fresh and healthy. Money began entering his hands and soon he bought new clothes. Then he repaired his leaking roof. Then he bought a small motorcycle. The villagers stared in disbelief. Mama Ubi shook her head one evening. This boy who used to sleep all day is now becoming the richest farmer. But soon, strange things began happening. First, a goat disappeared near the forest. Then, two chickens vanished from a compound close to the bush. Mama Ubi shouted one morning, "Whoever is stealing animals will answer to the village elders." At first, people thought it was ordinary theft. Villages usually had small quarrels over goats and chickens. A careless animal could wander off, or a hungry boy could quietly carry one away to eat. But this time, the matter did not stop at that. The following week, two goats vanished. Then three chickens disappeared from Mama Ubi's compound. One afternoon, a hunter named Edewo came back from the forest shaking his head. "I saw strange footprints near the bush path," he said. "What kind of footprints?" someone asked. Edewo shrugged. "They look like something dragged through the soil." The villagers murmured uneasily. Temison stood quietly by the side. His eyes moved slowly toward the forest, toward Ejiro's farm. That same evening, Papa Igoyota walked slowly toward the farmland with his staff in his hand. The old man had farmed longer than most men in Urodo had been alive. He believed the land spoke, but only patient people could hear. He arrived at Ejiro's farm without announcing himself. Ejiro was harvesting vegetables. "Good evening, Papa," he greeted. The old man nodded. "Good evening." He walked across the ridges slowly. He bent down and picked up a handful of soil. He rubbed it between his fingers. Then he looked toward the broken shrine. "Did you disturb anything when you started this farm?" he asked. Ejiro blinked. "No." The old man nodded slowly, but his eyes showed he did not believe the answer. "The land remembers something," Papa Igoyota said. Ejiro smiled awkwardly. "Papa, this land only remembers fertilizer." The old man did not laugh. He tapped the soil gently with his staff. "Nature never gives without collecting," he said. Then he turned and walked back to the village. Unfortunately, that night, Ejiro suddenly woke up from sleep. The digging sound came again and the whispers returned. But this time, the whisper came clearly. "You woke the land." Ejiro sat upright in his bed. His heart was pounding. "I did not call you," he whispered into the darkness. The voice came again. "You planted where the shrine fed us." The room felt colder now. Ejiro stuttered. What do you want?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then the whisper answered, "The offerings." Ejiro's mind began running wild to all the old stories about the shrine, the sacrifices and the forgotten rituals. "You want animals?" he asked nervously. The whisper replied, "The harvest grows, the death grows." The next day, Ejiro bought a small goat from the market. He did not tell anyone what it was for, but later that night, he secretly carried the goat into the forest. Ejiro tied the animal near the clay pots and stepped back. "This is enough," he said, and quickly left. The next morning, his farm looked stronger than ever. The cassava leaves shone bright under the sun, and the vegetables spread wider across the ridges. Ejiro smiled. "Good." And that was how the pattern continued. Each time he left an animal near the shrine, the farm grew stronger. Money continued flowing. He changed his motorcycle to a better one and continued living large, while the villagers watched in disbelief. But unfortunately, one night the whisper returned again. This time, the voice sounded stronger. "The harvest grows." Ejiro sat on his bed trembling. "What do you want now?" The answer came slowly. "The death grows. We require more." Ejiro's voice shook. "I have been giving you animals." The voice returned again. "Animals feed the soil. We require life." Ejiro's blood turned cold. "No," he whispered. But the voice did not argue. Instead, the next morning, the farm began changing. The cassava leaves looked weak and some vegetables turned yellow. The soil lost its rich color. By evening, several plants had already begun rotting. Ejiro ran to the shrine that night and shouted into the darkness, "I will not do it." The forest remained silent, but the farm continued dying. Meanwhile, something terrible happened in Urodo. A young farmer named Okiemute disappeared near the forest path. His family searched all through the bush until nightfall, but found nothing. Fear gripped the village. Papa Igoyota gathered the elders and said, "The land has taken what it was promised." Temison looked at Ejiro, who was looking downward ashamed. That night, some elders marched to the forest. They found the shrine and the farm. They also found the bones of animals scattered around the clay pots. Papa Igoyota struck the ground with his staff and declared, "This land must sleep again." The men destroyed the farm, uprooted the cassava and cut down the vegetables. Papa Igoyota poured palm oil into the earth, while the elders spoke the old words meant to close spiritual doors. Slowly, the strange heaviness over the land disappeared. The wind became normal again and the ground stopped moving. By sunset, the farm had become bare soil. That morning, Ejiro stood staring at the ruined land. His wealth was gone. His crops were gone. Even the motorcycle he bought had suddenly begun to rust. Unfortunately, the matter was not finished. That night, while Ejiro slept, the digging sound returned again. Ejiro opened his eyes in fright and held his breath. The sound was not coming from the forest this time. It was coming from outside his house. Ejiro sat up and whispered, "No!" A whisper came through the darkness. The harvest ended. Ejiro trembled and argued, "But I destroyed the farm." The voice continued, "The death remains." Suddenly, the door of his hut flung open, even though no hand touched it. A dry wind entered the room. Ejiro tried to stand, but his legs refused to move. The whisper returned again, closer now. "You woke the land." Something cold touched his feet. Ejiro screamed as the floor beneath him shifted like loose sand. The ground inside the hut cracked open in thin lines and dark shapes moved beneath the ground. The same shapes he had seen on the farm. Ejiro crawled toward the door and cried, "I will repay it." The whisper answered, "Of course you will." Immediately, the soil swallowed his legs first and dragged him downward. Ejiro shouted with terror, "Help me!" But the village was asleep. The whisper spoke one last time. "The land collects what it is owed." The ground closed and the huts became quiet again. By morning, the villagers noticed something strange. Ejiro's door was open, but his house was empty. Papa Igoyota looked at the ground and shook his head. The land has taken its payments. No one searched the forest for Ejiro or spoke loudly about it. The villagers simply returned to their farms, and from that day, the abandoned land in the forest remained untouched. Thank you for watching this story. Kindly share your thoughts about the story with me in the comment section. Kindly give the story a thumbs up and share the story out with your loved ones. Subscribe to this channel if you've not done so by now. Until I bring another story your way. Bye.